So we have an interesting question here and kind of a little background. This is from Melinda Liu, who's the Newsweek Beijing bureau chief. So thank you for being on, and she thanks, she's thanking the panel and says that there's great insights. So we're happy to hear that. But she says, as someone who was involved in the Foreign Correspondents Club of China as an FCCC president in the run-up to the 2008 Olympics, her observation of the Olympics would be, you're going to need every tiny bit of leverage you can get. So use it, even if you don't think much will come out of it. I think it's an interesting point. She says, today, the 2007 to 2008 period stands out as an example of how things got somewhat better. Better is always better. The problem is it may not last. And she says how ironic and telling is that some now look back with nostalgia to the days of Jiang Zemin. She's also saying, and I think the point she's making, I don't know if there's really a question here, but somebody might want to remark on it, is, we look back, even a few years ago with nostalgia, or to some degree with nostalgia. And I guess this gets to another question that was asked earlier. Are these the really bad days for journalists, and might we see something better, or is this the sort of new normal for what journalism could be in China, that all our news organizations are going to have to think of as, this is how we cover things. I guess I'll ask Chris to take that, having been there through a lot of years, a lot of different Chinese presidents, a lot of US presidents.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think to the question and the observation about the Olympics. I'm certainly not saying give up. I do think in the end, though, that lasting change in China is going to be generated by whatever happens domestically. And we have to remind ourselves that we have seen these periods, well, let me put it this way, that foreign journalists in China are simply a small part of an ecosystem in China, which a much more important part of that is our colleagues, our friends in the Chinese journalist world and the work they do. And what we've seen over time, I'm thinking of SARS in 2003. I'm thinking of the political scandals and infighting that led up to Xi Jinping becoming leader in 2012. I'm thinking of COVID-19 in Wuhan last year. You see in those periods that although the Chinese Communist Party is extremely powerful and in many ways enjoys broad backing from many people in China, there can also be a hunger for information from the population in China. And Chinese journalists can respond to that when given the opportunity. And it's certainly the case in COVID last year that a lot of, so much of the most important reporting about what happened in the early days, what went wrong, what the missteps were, that was led by Chinese journalists and Chinese news outlets who in many ways pushing the envelope. So, in some ways, I do think it's still true that we as foreign journalists have to ride the tides of general control of information in China. And I think those tides can go in and out. And even under Xi Jinping, even now, we saw last year that, when there's a crisis, when something goes wrong, people hunger for information. And I don't think that hunger is going to go away. That doesn't mean that it's going to manifest itself in the way that some Western politicians like. It doesn't mean that it's going to lead to particular pathways to change in China, but I think that desire is still there.
Yeah, good point. Good point to make. I'm going to throw this out here. I don't know that there's a question, but this is from Steve Butler, who many of us know. Hi, Steve. Thanks for the question. Will expelled journalists apply to return for the Olympics in Beijing? He says accreditation depends on national committees. Does anyone think that there's, someone's going to do that? I'm not so sure, but it's an interesting idea.
Australia has very little snow and it's not a leader in winter sports, but I'll certainly be applying.
Very good. Gerry or Yvonne, do you want to take a stab at that?
That's probably not my decision.
All right.
People more senior than me will be making that call.
Good. Okay. Good. Well, thanks to Steve for the question. We have a question from Jocelyn Ford, who's been working with us on the OPC China Working Group. She asked, what should the financial and business communities be aware of regarding how China's restrictions on reporting affect information related to their decision making? That's an interesting question, one that they're grappling with in Hong Kong now. The business community had been fairly had been going along with the changes because they didn't have much choice, and now seem to be realizing that this can really affect their business, particularly open markets. I'd be interested, maybe Gerry, you want to take a stab at that in terms of, whether this is something that businesses. And perhaps when you were there, did you see businesses start to kind of push back on this in the financial community, not just the journalism community, because it started not being in their interest?
Yeah, one sort of anecdote that comes to mind, I'm not sure what the takeaway is. I just recall, if we start from the premise that financial markets sort of rely on instantaneous and sort of transparent sort of dissemination of material information. I just remember in 2019, there was this bizarre case when at the height of the trade war, Trump's sort of comments and his tweets and his statements about tariffs were censored inside China, but the markets would sort of tank when he would go off on one of these rants on Twitter about tariffs. And there were people sort of kind of asking on Chinese social media, like, hey, what's going on? Like, why is the market down? I mean, of course, Chinese investors, a great deal, many of them are very savvy and know how to use VPN and can immediately figure out, what exactly happened. But I guess, it's just sort of, it was an example that pointed to some of the contradictions between, some of these political controls and sort of China's aspirations to become a major international financial center, and so, how does it, how does that work out? I don't know, but I think that, international firms in Hong Kong, my understanding is that they are starting to think about next steps and, what they have to do, where they have to move people out of Hong Kong. And, it's a very sensitive subject for Hong Kong authorities, but, international capital knows that the writing is on the wall, and at some point it's not in their best interest to remain in this, in an environment.
Yeah, Yvonne or Chris, do you have any thoughts on that, on the financial community, and whether there's anything they can do or anything they are likely to do, given the information situation in China writ large, including Hong Kong?
I don't have too much to add to what Gerry was saying, apart from the observation that we have seen with China being such a big business story and such a big story in tech in particular. You're seeing that interest from readers, from audiences, from news companies reflected in the amount of effort that's going into reporting those stories and the creative ways in which journalists are finding ways to report these issues out, even if they can't be on the ground in China, or even if being on the ground in China doesn't get you the full story. And I think, as you know, with Bloomberg, Jodi, there's a great deal of very good work being done on data-driven journalism, so people can get to a story in China, even if some ways you can't be fully on the ground there.